Good afternoon. My computer is blinging and beeping and all of that kind of stuff. Good afternoon and welcome to People Making Money, one of the Way to Wow shows. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and it is 12:30 p.m. Wednesday Pacific time or 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we're here every week to talk about matters related to careers, starting a business, running a business, personal finances, and building wealth. So today, I'm going to talk about the myriad of issues that both employers and employees need to consider when they're negotiating over a job. And this is, it's actually chapter 39 in my book, for those of you who may have it. I think it's important to go through this for both sides of the process, because with the tight labor market we have now, I think employers can expect employees to be more concerned about a broader range of issues and to negotiate harder for those things. And I think that if you are looking for a job or planning on changing a job, it's good for you to know the full range of issues that could be of concern with respect to a position, so that even if one or more of them aren't particularly important to you, okay, fine, but at least you know they're there and you had a chance to make an informed decision about that particular aspect. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up this section of my book. So I have several chapters on what to do once you've gotten a job offer, and this is one of them. Okay, and so what am I doing here? There we go. Yeah, it doesn't want to do it. Try one more time. Okay, there we go. Okay, so what I recommend you do is for each job offer that you get, that you make a list of those issues that are important to you and what you may already know about them in terms of previous discussions you've had with various people at the organization. And then you can figure out what is left to work out. Okay, so in each of these issues, there's really two questions that you want to answer for yourself. Okay, one is what you expect to get. Now, that may be different than what you ask for. Okay, so let's just take a real basic one: salary. Okay, you may ask for $100,000 a year, but you may only expect that you're going to get, 85,000 or something like that. Now, if you expect to get $100,000 a year, you may be, wise to ask for maybe $105,000 or $110,000 a year. Okay, so that's one issue you want to consider, is what you expect to get and how that will impact your negotiations. And the second is, why is your expectation reasonable? Okay, so if let's just say, for the sake of discussion, you're being offered a job as a barista, and your salary expectations are $100,000 a year. I think your expectations are not reasonable. Now, one of the ways you could find out is to go on a site like Indeed or, Glassdoor, and see what are companies paying, what are people getting for that particular job in the area where you're looking. Okay, so if it were the case that baristas were routinely getting, let's say, $95,000 a year, okay, and you want $100,000 a year. So you might make the case, well, my expectation is reasonable because the labor market is tight and businesses are having a hard time hiring baristas. And so they're going to have to, up what they've been willing to pay staff in order to get them to take a job. That's a perfectly reasonable basis for your expectation. Okay. In other situations, frankly, your expectation may not be reasonable. And so even though you've gotten a job offer, your negotiations probably won't go that well because what you're asking for is just not reasonable. And you're either going to have to rethink your position or, face, making some big concessions as the negotiations proceed. So the first issue that I think you want to consider is your job description. Now, this may be already set. It may have been part of what you learned during the process where you're meeting with various people in the organization about the job. Okay, that having been said, you may see things within the job description that you don't like to do or don't want to do for some reason. There may be a lot of travel involved or something, and maybe that just doesn't work for you, or you want to put limits on it. If you have children, maybe you don't want to be traveling very much, so you'll do some traveling, but you want to put limits on how much travel is required within your job description. Okay, so and the flip side is there may be things that are not in your job description that are going on within the company or organization, and you want an opportunity to be involved in those things. So in that case, you may want to negotiate to add something to the job description. Okay, now if there's no set job description, it may fall on you to write something, because you need to understand, what are you responsible for doing? What is your decision-making authority? To whom do you report? Who reports to you? What are your responsibilities? All of those things need to be clear. Otherwise, both you and the employer are setting each other up for potentially failure, right? And if you're an employer, being clear about what your expectations are for this new person you're hiring is going to make it a lot easier to onboard the person and have them successfully integrate into your organization. Okay, so that's job description. Next, title. Okay, so titles are important. Okay, that's just the bottom line. Now, they get more important as you advance up the ranks. So obviously, to have the title of president is much better than to have the title of director or manager. Okay, so what is your title going to be, and how does that title relate to the duties and responsibilities you have, as well as the people with whom you're going to interact, both inside the company and people outside the company, right? So banks are famous for making everybody a vice president, assistant vice president, executive vice president, like super. There's another one in there. I forget what it is, but anyway, there's all these. Like everybody at the bank is a vice president, basically, and it's to give them some standing as they deal with customers of the bank, etc. Okay, so while a company may not want to go to that degree, I think we do want to consider carefully the titles that we're giving people, because they have an impact on how effective someone can be in their job, how they can deal with clients and customers, etc. Okay, and they matter to people. I mean, there is prestige in being a vice president as opposed to a manager. Okay, so that's another issue to keep in mind. It's connected to job description, but it may need to be dealt with separately. Okay, next, to whom you'll report. So in this case, we're really dealing with how much influence is the person likely to have within the business or organization. Okay, so someone who is able to report directly to the president or CEO is going to have a lot more influence, right, on what happens in the company, as opposed to someone who reports to an assistant vice president or reports to an area manager or something like that. So, and such things can be very important. Okay, so we tend to think that salary is the most important issue, and while it may be the most important issue, it doesn't mean that it's the only important issue, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other issues that, coupled with salary, may afford you as the person doing the hiring to perhaps not have to pay as high a salary in exchange for the person having a bigger impact on what may happen within the company. More decision-making authority, more ability to affect the decisions of the people who are senior to them in the organization. So, I mean, these days, I think most companies are flattening out their sort of chains of command, to use a military term, right? And they're getting rid of more and more of sort of middle managers, right? And that's a good thing, because information can flow up and down the ranks more readily when there's fewer people in between, number one. And just like with the game of telephone, information can get passed more accurately when it's passing through fewer hands. Okay, so for both sides of the issue, this is a very important decision to make. Now, again, it may already be decided that this person is going to be reporting to the executive vice president for human resources or whatever. Okay, but there may be some negotiating room there, and there may be it depending on, like, if you have a compliance job, okay, it may be that although you're going to report to the vice president of compliance, you may be able to negotiate that in certain cases you're able to report directly to the president when there's a problem, or when you think that there's something going on from a compliance issue that isn't being handled correctly. Okay, so those are all issues to give some thought to. Okay, and that flows quickly into autonomy, authority, and responsibility. So especially in dealing with younger people, they are much more concerned with the impact they can have on an organization from the get-go than perhaps any generation that's been involved in the American workplace ever. And I suspect that this is the same thing in the workplaces in Europe and Asia as well. Younger people want to feel that they have a stake in the organization with which they're associated. Okay, so that has a big impact then on how much autonomy, authority, and responsibility they seek. Now, there's trade-offs, right? For someone who's new to the job world, does it make sense to give them a lot of autonomy and a lot of authority and responsibility? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, the key thing, I think, is to make sure it's clear at what point they can make decisions, and at what point they need to get authorization from the person to whom they report. Okay, so make it clear for them where that is. And if there are gray areas, then be clear that this is a gray area. It's going to be a judgment call, and it's going to be up to you whether to seek input from your senior, whether to refer it to them for a decision, Okay. And people want to know that if they make a decision, their supervisor is going to back them up. So if you're somebody's supervisor, you need to be clear where your limit is in terms of backing that person up. Okay. So you don't want to get into a situation where it's unclear. They've gone ahead and made a decision on their own responsibility, and now you don't want to stand behind that decision. But if you sort of, throw them under the bus, that's going to cause a big problem. Okay. And in many cases, I think you can count on people being reasonable in the sense of understanding their autonomy, their authority, their responsibility is going to grow over time, and talking about how is that growth going to work. Okay. So, as the relationship matures, as more and more trust grows between people, so then their ability to make autonomous decisions can grow as well. Okay, so as important as it is to define where this level is, it's equally important for people to understand how will that grow. Okay, how can I gain more autonomy, more responsibility? Okay, both of those need to be carefully considered. Next, okay, salary. So this is obviously going to be one of the biggest concerns. Most people who are looking for a job are doing so because they need to earn money in order to live or in order to support themselves and their families, right? So the best thing you can do, and I mentioned a little bit about this before, for both sides, is to understand what is the market currently paying for a position like the one that's being discussed, okay, in the location where the person lives, okay, unless they're going to have to relocate for the job. So in California, almost everywhere you live, it's expensive than most other places in the country, right? And so if you're hiring someone in California and they're going to have to live in California, either because that's where your organization is located or they're going to be working remotely. So there has to be an understanding of, if a sales rep in Indiana makes, $75,000 a year, great. That may be a perfectly fine salary to make, or a perfectly fine income to make in Indiana. I can tell you here in Los Angeles, that is not going to take you very far. Okay. First of all, taxes in California are one of the highest of, among the 50 United States. In fact, I think currently they are the highest. Okay. So that's going to have an impact. Real estate costs are very, very high, whether you own or rent, doesn't matter. They're very, very high. So $75,000 a year just does not go nearly as far as it does in a Midwestern state or in a state in the Southeast for the most part. Okay, now there are areas that are catching up. Miami is becoming more and more expensive. The Washington D.C. area more and more expensive. Okay, but I think in terms of cost, the highest ones are New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco probably. So that all has to be taken into account when you're dealing with salary. All right. And again, there's lots of places you can go on the internet now. You can search based on job titles, job descriptions, and see what companies are offering, what companies are paying, so that there can be a rational basis for discussion, as opposed to excuse me, I want this, well, we only want to pay that, and the twain can't meet. All right. Start date. So this is particularly important. Well, I'm gonna withdraw that comment. It's going to be important no matter what. If the person isn't working, they may be very desirous of starting as soon as possible, right? Especially if they've been out of work for a long time, they're going to want to most likely get back to work. In other cases, they may be currently in a job, and so they're going to have to give at least 2 weeks notice, or at least a week's notice or whatever, but maybe they need to give a month's notice, or maybe they're in a situation where for various reasons, they need a couple of months before they're going to be able to leave. So start date is going to be difficult. Now, by the same token, the company, you may have an immediate demand for somebody. You need somebody who can start right away. So if you've got someone who's currently in a job and they're in the midst of a big project and they cannot, justify leaving that current company for at least a month or two, and you need someone to start next week, that's a problem. Now, maybe there's a way of working it out. Maybe the person can, work part-time in the new job in the evenings and on weekends, getting things going while they finish fulfilling their commitment to their current company. Maybe that's a workable solution. In any event, start date should be clear, okay? And it shouldn't be, well, you'll start sometime next week. You'll start, Wednesday of next week. You'll start in 2 weeks from today, or you'll start July 1st, or whatever it is. Should be very, very clear. Okay. All right. Next is benefits. Now, this can run a huge gamut, and some of the things we're going to talk about farther down the list you might include in benefits, but I'm going to talk about some of the general ones. So the most common are health insurance, dental insurance, or medical care. That's pretty common these days. Now, how the health insurance works varies a lot. In large companies, they may have a plan that has virtually no out-of-pocket expense for their employees, or they may have a plan where you've got a policy with a very high deductible, but they match that with some kind of health savings account or some sort of account that's established that pays for, that gap between what the insurance covers and what otherwise would be out of pocket. There's lots of creative ways now that insurance is being dealt with because it's gotten so much more expensive, okay? And they may offer dental care, they may offer eye care, prescription drug, care. They may offer physical therapy, all kinds of different things. And it's got to be well understood by both employer and employee, the extent of that care. Okay. Another thing may be life insurance. Now, typically the amount of life insurance you're going to get as an employee, it might be, a month or two of salary, and it's there so that if, God forbid you die, your family doesn't lose, in essence, doesn't lose the income immediately, but rather this life insurance policy gives them a couple of months in order to sort of get things sorted out. Okay. Now, the flip side is there may be key man insurance. Okay. And this is actually really more of a benefit to the company. So if you're particularly beneficial to the company, they may want to insure you so that if, God forbid, you die, and all of a sudden they've got this huge gap, in their workforce, that whatever loss the company may sustain, they're getting some recompense for it. So in terms of benefits, your insurability may be an issue. Now, if it's group benefits, that's generally not a problem, because since you're part of the group, you're eligible for these benefits along with everybody else at the company. But for something like key man insurance, now you might have to pass a medical exam or other things. Okay. And so now how all these benefits gets worked out gets more complex. Okay. Now there's other benefits, again, that we'll talk about, things like, are you going to get a car? Are you going to get a clothing allowance, those kind of things. So I think those are farther down on the list. But keep in mind, so another big benefit is there some kind of pension plan or some kind of more likely these days a retirement plan as opposed to a pension plan. Very, very, very few companies have defined benefit pension plans anymore. I think certainly a lot of governments still do, but even in the military, they are shifting to sort of a hybrid defined benefit pension a retirement plan formula, if you will. And most companies these days, private companies anyway, they all have a 401k plan or something like that. And there may be some kind of matching. So if you contribute $100 a month, the company will match it to 50% or whatever that is, or they'll match it up to a certain amount, and you can put in more than that amount, but they'll only match up to, $200 a month or whatever that is. Okay. All of that, again, needs to be worked out. It needs to be clear so that the person understands, is there a vesting period? In other words, does the employee have to be working at the company for a certain period of time before they're eligible to participate in the retirement plan, or for that matter, even to get health insurance? Okay. And do they have to be in the plan for a certain amount of time before those benefits will go with them if they leave? Okay. Now, if it's a plan that they've paid into, almost for sure, they're going to be able to take that money with them if they leave. Okay. But where is that money being invested? Is it being invested in the company's stock? Right. And so now you're leaving the company. Okay, I'm investing in all this company's stock, but I'm not at the company anymore. I want to diversify my retirement account or something. Are you able to do that? Those are all questions that need to be asked and need to be understood as you negotiate your compensation package. Okay. Now, next is evaluations. So this is really, they go by many different names: progress reports. In the Navy, we called them fitness reports. They have a different name in the Army, and I'm going up on what the name is. But in any event, it is the periodic review of how you're doing at the company, how you're doing in your job, and they have a direct impact on A, whether you're going to be retained in the position, B, whether you're going to be promoted, C, whether you're going to get a salary increase. Okay. So they're very, very important. And how are they going to be done? So I will tell you, as crazy as this sounds to people who are not familiar with the military system, in my career as a military chaplain, with only maybe one or two exceptions, I wrote my own evaluation. So now, having said that, it was submitted to my commanding officer, and they usually changed things, but oftentimes they didn't know the full extent of all the things that I was doing at their command. And so they couldn't accurately evaluate how good a job I had done, because they just didn't know things. Because you have something in the Navy called a command master chief. That's the senior enlisted person in the command. And chaplains generally work very closely with this person. And that person will know a lot, oftentimes will know a lot more about day-to-day what the chaplain is doing, interacting with personnel, than the commanding officer will. And so, these things have to be brought to the commanding officer's attention so that an accurate fitness report evaluation can be written. Okay. Now, I don't ever recall in my, civilian career preparing my own evaluation, although the fact of the matter is I rarely worked for someone else in my civilian career. But nonetheless, there should be some kind of interactive process before your evaluation is finalized. Okay. So, if the company has a situation where your supervisor, writes your evaluation, you meet with them, and they tell you, okay, here's your evaluation, and that's it. Boy, that's a pretty tough thing to deal with. What if you have conflict with your supervisor? What if you've been tasked with a project that just turns out to be much more difficult than anybody anticipated? How are those kinds of things going to be dealt with? And what if you're doing a job where you interact with a lot of people at a company, not just the supervisor? Like in my case, as being a chaplain, your supervisor may not know the full extent of your impact on the company. And so there should be a process of understanding what you've done, what progress you've made, what accomplishments you've had, et cetera, to make sure that whoever is ultimately responsible for your evaluation has as full a picture of your work as possible. Okay. And again, it should be pretty clear what that is, what that process is. Okay. Next is growth and promotion opportunities. So while, you don't want to appear probably as an employee too eager to, be promoted or whatever to get out of the job that you're currently talking about. Nonetheless, if you are concerned about your ability to grow within the company, so that should be discussed up front. The reality is there are some jobs where you're just not going to have much growth opportunity. So, for example, if you're coming in as like a senior accounting person, and the leadership in that department is all by people who have been there for 5 to 10 years, they're well entrenched, they have no intention of leaving. And they're all relatively young, so they're not going to be, retiring or anything anytime soon. Is that really a situation that you want to get yourself into, where there's little, if any, growth or promotion opportunity? Now, by the way, it may be the case that there's not much opportunity within the department that you're joining, but maybe as a company, they will allow you to look at sort of parallel moves or moves that are sort of parallel, but a promotion as well into a different department that can use the skills that you have, your experience in the company, in perhaps a different way. Okay, so growth doesn't have to be narrowly defined; it can be more broadly defined in the organization. Okay, so this is another aspect. And there, in the end, there may not, be anything clearly defined about what growth and promotion opportunities there are. But even if there's an informal agreement that, you'll be considered for promotion after 6 months. So this can also be a good way to sort of, sniff out how things really work at the company. So if the person who hires you tells you, well, look, I can't guarantee you a promotion in 6 months, but here's what I can do. I can guarantee you that you'll be considered for a promotion in 6 months, and we'll evaluate you at that time. Or, if a position in your department opens up that would be appropriate for your progression, so you'll be considered for that opportunity. Okay. And let's say you accept that as a, an unwritten part of your employment situation. And let's say, you find out, hey, somebody kind of one step up from me is leaving, and I've been here now for 6 months, or I've been here for 7 months, and I've gotten to know my job well, I've gotten to know the company well. And, you either, kind of wait and see if you're contacted about the position, or you go to your supervisor and say, hey, or you go to the person who hired you, hey, remember when you hired me, you said I'd be considered for an opening that came up in the department. I heard that such and such a person is leaving in a couple of weeks, and, I want to throw my hat in the ring. So, how they handle that will be an important indication of what kind of company you're working for. So if they say to you, Oh, we've already filled it. Oh, I thought I was going to be considered. Well, there was someone ideal for the job, and so it was given to them, last week, or it was given to them before the person announced that they were leaving. Well, okay. I mean, that happens, but that doesn't sound like the person making good on what they told you. The flip side may be that they say, "Hey, great, I'm glad you brought this up. I needed to get in touch with you about this. We need to arrange for your supervisor to do an evaluation and submit that, so then you can be considered for the position." Right? Those are very different ways of responding to that same informal agreement, and it tells you something about the people with whom you're working and about the company. Okay. All right. Next is vacation time. Now, I use the term vacation time, but more broadly, it's, time off, paid or otherwise. So you may have a certain amount of paid vacation. You may have sick days, or you may just have what they call personal days. So you don't necessarily have to be sick, but you've got a certain number of days you can call in and say, "Hey, I won't be in today." And you're still paid your salary. You may also be eligible for a certain number of unpaid days. You may be eligible for maternity or paternity leave. All of these things come into how this issue is dealt with. Now, there's at least two or three different, I'll call them standards. One is what federal law requires. Okay. The next is what state law requires. And then there's what's standard, if you will, practice in your industry. Okay. And you want to find out what each one of those requires, so that when you go in to talk about this, you may be offered, a week of vacation time a year, no maternity leave, no sick days, or 5 sick days, or whatever it is. And you may say to the person, "Hey, my understanding is that state law requires that I get, 2 months of paid maternity leave, and I'm entitled to, 10 personal days a year, or 10 sick leave days a year, whatever that is." So, or by the way, there may be a union contract, in which case a lot of this stuff is, somewhat superfluous, because the union contract will dictate all of this. But nonetheless, if you're being hired into a position where, parts of it are unionized and parts of it are not, so then the union contract may set somewhat of a standard for what people in the kind of job you're looking at get. Okay, now you may not get quite as much as you get if you were a union member, okay, because of various different things. On the other hand, you may be able to negotiate something better because you're not in the union, and so the company views it as having more flexibility, more ability to sort of tailor things depending on what your position requires. So all of that needs to be examined and understood, again, by both employer and employee, in order to make as good an employment agreement as possible. Okay, next, office and flexible work locations. So, no surprise, remote work appears to be here to stay. So, is your job going to be 100% remote? Are you going to be required to be in the office 5 days a week? Is it some kind of hybrid? What is that? Is it going to be necessary for you to work in more than one office location? Okay, so this is becoming more common. So one of my doctors has offices in, I think, 4 locations in California, 3 in Southern California, 1 in Northern California. Honestly, how he deals with that, I don't know. What I do know is he rotates between the locations. And in fact, so do some of his staff. So sometimes I'll call the number and I'll be talking to the person, and she'll be in Orange County. And then I might call the next week on a different day of the week, and now she's up here in Beverly Hills. So how is that going to work for your location? Are you going to have to be going out to visit clients and customers? Okay. Or do they come to see you? If you're going to be, selling automobiles for a dealership, is part of your work going to be to deliver those automobiles to buyers? Okay, that's becoming more common. The last two cars I bought, in both cases, they were brought to my house. I never went to the dealership. Okay. In one case, someone from the dealer brought it out. In the other case, I have a friend who's a car broker, car buyer. And so in the second case, he brought the car to my house. So all of these are issues when it comes to office and, in terms of work location, I should say. And how much flexibility do you have to decide whether you're going to go into the office or not? And a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations are struggling with that right now. So they've recognized there's a value to their business to having people in the office. On the other hand, given the labor shortage, they're reluctant to, in some cases, to impose work location requirements. And so that's a much more negotiable factor than it probably has ever been before. Okay, now going with office work location is flexible scheduling, right? Again, this was a big thing that came up during the COVID time. So what hours do you have to work? Are you expected to be on the, it used to be standard, 9 to 5 work day, okay? These days, my sense is a lot of people are not on that 9 to 5 thing anymore. Okay. Now, especially for people who are working from home, while they may need to be able to answer a call during the regular workday, they may be able to do work in the evenings. They may be able to do it on the weekends or very early mornings or whatever. And as long as they get their work done, that's really what matters. Okay. And now, in terms of flexible scheduling too, if you're in a job, let's say you're doing recruiting. Well, so depending on who you're recruiting, working during the day may not work very well because people are working at other jobs. And so for them to have time to speak and meet with you, they just can't, because they're not going to talk to a potential new employer while they're at their current employer's place of business, or while they're expected to be working for their other employer. So it may be that, you are going to have to be working evenings and weekends more, right? That's true also for someone like a residential real estate agent. Okay. They're going to be working evenings and weekends, because that's typically when people tend to have time to go look at, potential homes to buy. Now, that also depends. So for people who, like here in Los Angeles, a lot of people work in the entertainment business. So 9 to 5 isn't necessarily what they're working. So they may have time all during the week or whatever. All of that has to be understood, and it needs to be worked out. There needs to be agreement there. Now, by the way, both sides may need to exercise some flexibility even once an agreement has been reached, as the business changes, as situations change, et cetera, et cetera. So just because something is in an agreement, and even if that agreement is written, that doesn't mean that there can't be flexibility as time goes by, so that things will work better for both parties involved. Okay, so if you're the employee and you set your working hours 8 to 3 because you want to be able to go pick up your child from school and then be home in the afternoon and evening with your child, that probably needs to be understood up front with your employer, so that they understand, when it comes to my schedule, I don't have flexibility. Okay, I have childcare requirements, or maybe you have an adult that you take care of, an elderly adult. Okay, and you're responsible for taking care of them. All that needs to be understood up front to avoid conflict down the road. Okay, travel. Now, I mentioned travel toward the beginning of this show, and there's, look, it can be as little as you may be asked to attend some kind of annual conference for the company. Okay, and it's not absolutely required, although it's highly encouraged kind of thing. To travel is a part of the day-to-day work that you're going to be doing, right? If you're going to be in aircraft sales, I think you're going to be traveling often. By the way, same if you're in pharmaceutical sales, you're going to be going out to doctors' offices, hospitals, whatever. Now, you in the latter case, you may be traveling fairly locally within your territory. If you're in aircraft sales, you may be traveling all over the world. It just depends on where your customers are at. Now, these days with things like Zoom and such, maybe you're not going to have to travel as much, but you may have to go to air shows to meet prospective customers and do networking and prospecting and all of that. How is that all going to work? Okay. Are you going to, take the very first example I gave, going to an annual conference? Is your company going to pay for you to go? Or is that why they're not making it mandatory? Because they're not going to pay for you to go. So they highly encourage you to go, but you're going to have to pay for it yourself. Or maybe, you have to pay for the airfare, but there's, you get a special rate on the hotel or whatever. And maybe meals are going to be supplied, but, you got to pay airfare and lodging or whatever it is. Again, all of that should be understood up front, so you know what the expectations are for you. Now, I remember this is when I was still in the Navy. I was given a billet at an air wing. It's a group of squadrons that then deploy on an aircraft carrier, and the air wing is the sort of overarching organization to the individual squadrons. So I was talking to the chaplain that I was replacing, and he was telling me that when he was on deployment, at each port call, he chipped in for, it was like a hotel room where people socialized and they bought booze and whatever, food and all this kind of stuff. And he routinely spent something like $1,000 per port call. I'm like, well, how many port calls did you do? He said, oh gosh, I think we did 8 or 10. I'm like, so you spent between $8,000 and $10,000 on that alone while you were deployed? He's like, yeah, it was great, no big deal. And I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, wow, because in the military, unless you're traveling, on leave or something, if you're traveling for work, everything's being paid. You're getting a meal allowance, you're paying lodging, air, flight, rental car, whatever it is, it's all being paid for. I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if I like this. And I thought about, canceling or seeing if I could get out of the job. And I talked to someone else. I think it was someone else at the air wing. I think it may have been at the fellow who was the deputy commander of the air group, who later then became the air wing commander and my boss. And I talked to him about that. He said, no, it's not required. Don't worry about that. He said, I've rarely done that on deployment, and I've been on 10 of them. Like, oh, okay. Right. So, I'm not saying that the other fellow gave me bad information. He was just giving me the information from his perspective, what worked for him. So, make sure that you get information from more than one source if possible, so you understand the full picture of these things. Okay. There may be what the person who will be your supervisor is telling you, and there may be what someone who's had the job will tell you, and they may not be exactly the same, right? So it'd be good to get both those perspectives. All right. Now, by the way, you may want to travel, right? And you may want that to be a part of your job, or you may want the opportunity to travel to be a part of your work. So then maybe if it's not, but you feel there are opportunities within what you're doing, that traveling will make it easier for you to do your job, or it'll make it easier for you to do a better job. So then that's something to talk about, as you are negotiating your overall compensation package. Maybe you can negotiate that the company will send you to conferences twice a year, and they'll pay the airfare and the lodging. You have to cover meals or whatever, because you would have had to have paid to eat anyway. And that gives you an opportunity to travel that you otherwise wouldn't have had, or would have had to pay for yourself, or taken time off from your job and used vacation time or whatever to travel. And now instead, the company will give you those opportunities. So again, it's especially in these days when the labor market is so tight, you may have more leverage in these things than you would during a time where, the labor market is not nearly as tight as it is now. Okay. All right. And I think that is, oh, here we go. There's at least one more. So daycare reimbursement. Okay. If you have children, okay, and they're maybe too young to go to school, or maybe they might go to nursery school for a couple of hours, and maybe you're a single parent or both parents work. So then how are you going to take care of your children, right? If you're not working from home, or even if you are working from home and you need to be able to dedicate your attention to doing your job. So what are you going to do about your children, right? And I've heard anecdotally, companies appear to be much more flexible about this than they have been. So I know the daughter of a friend of mine, she works, I believe it's 3 days out of the week at home. She has a child. And so what she does is she gets a nanny who comes in for several hours each of the 3 days she works at home. So, she doesn't have to be concerned about that her son is, there's nobody there to take care of him or to deal with his needs. And then, I think the last couple of hours of her workday, I think the nanny leaves and she arranges her schedule such that she's working, but she doesn't have meetings and that kind of thing. And that's doable. And that's workable from her employer's standpoint. In this case, I don't think they're reimbursing her at all, but they are accommodating her work schedule as part of her daycare requirements. Okay. So they're not making any, monetary outlay, but they are, being flexible. And that's a kind of non-monetary reimbursement, if you will. Okay. Now, some companies have, daycare right there on the campus where the offices are. So maybe, you can bring your child to work with you. That's that in the military, most bases nowadays have daycare centers. Okay. Now, this may not be an issue if your children are old enough to go to school. Okay. So, you're drop them at school on your way to work or whatever, or however they get to school, the bus or whatever. Okay. So daycare reimbursement, or you may not have children, so then it's not an issue, right, at all. Although I guess if you have, a pet that doesn't like to be home alone, so then maybe you have, doggy care issues or something like that. I can imagine that companies are, perhaps a little more open to that than they would have been even a few years ago. And perhaps that's something that you can raise. It depends on how much negotiating leverage you think you have. Okay. So, I don't have a pet and my daughter's in high school, so it's not an issue for me. But in any event, it's something to consider. Okay. Finally, tuition reimbursement. So does your company have any kind of educational opportunities for you? So Starbucks, for example, has a program. Well, they will pay for their employees to go to college. Okay, and I don't know the details of it. However, if you're in a job where it's kind of an entry level job, and you want an opportunity to advance through the company, and one of the things you'll need to do that is a degree. So then that's an important issue for you to talk to the person, the hiring manager, about what is available there or what can be negotiated there. Now, let's say, by the way, that you've completed your college education and maybe you have big student loans. What might the employer do with respect to helping you pay those loans? Okay. Now, if let's say you're a doctor, okay, and you're considering going to a place where they're having, maybe it's in a rural location where they're having trouble getting quality healthcare professionals. So maybe they're willing to reimburse some or all of, your medical school cost, depending on how long you're there. So maybe if you stay for 10 years, at the end of each year, they will pay off, 1/10 of your, medical school, college loans or something like that. Or maybe they'll pay off a 20th and you'll pay off a 20th. And so after 10 years, they're all paid off, or however that might work. Okay, so all of that should be discussed. And again, just like all these other issues, during times like now in a tight labor market, you may have more leverage on these issues than you will at a time when there's a lot more unemployment and there's more than one person per job available. Right now, it's the opposite way. There's more than one job available for people, right? But at some point that will change. And then, as an employee, your negotiating leverage will go down. Now, as an employer right now, you have less leverage than you might have had in the past. And so you may need to consider some of these things like daycare reimbursement, tuition reimbursement. They may be incentives to get good people. Okay, young people coming out of college today have typically a lot of debt. Nowadays, 1 year of, I think, even public, university tuition is higher than I think my whole 4-year degree cost me. And I went to USC, a private university, but I went to USC back in the late 70s and early 80s. So the tuition was much less, and tuition has just gotten much, much higher now. So it's a bigger issue for young people who are coming out of college. So, again, something to consider. Maybe there's a standard in the industry that you're joining that they do these kind of things. So what is that? And if you're not offered that up front, why are you not offered that up front? And I think it would be a good question to say, gee, I researched this industry, and my understanding is that after being at a company for 3 years, they will generally pay off, 20% of outstanding college debt, or 20% of original loan amounts, or whatever it is. I noticed this isn't part of the offer. Why is that the case? And let them explain it. Okay. By the way, if a company will not even address a question like that, I think that's a sign that you may want to dig deeper. Something's going on there. There shouldn't be anything wrong with you asking a question. And if the company doesn't like that, maybe that's not a good place to work. That shows an awful lot of inflexibility, especially these days, given the hunt for good employees that so many companies are on. Okay, so I would encourage you to ask questions as opposed to making demands. And if you get a good answer, okay, that makes sense. Or if you don't get a good answer, say, gosh, I honestly, I don't understand that rationale. Is there something else, going on? And maybe they can explain it a different way. And if not, I would start asking people, not necessarily people in the company, but I'd start asking people in the industry, hey, what's the deal with this company? It seems like every other company offers tuition reimbursement in some way, and they absolutely refuse to do it. Okay, and you may find out some things you didn't know. Oh yeah, they play such hardball, and it doesn't end once you work there. Okay, good information to know. All right, wardrobe and equipment allowance. Now, for most people, this may not be an issue, but if you're some kind of technician, or you're a plumber, an electrician, right? My impression is more and more companies these days are providing their service technicians with branded clothing. So, they'll wear whatever from, I had to have some plumbing work done on my home a couple of weeks ago. And all of them had, not only just, shirts with, I think it was A1 Plumbing, I want to say, but they also had their own names on the shirts, which was very impressive. I mean, I frankly think that's really professional, and it's also nice because the fellow comes out to do work, and he'll introduce himself, but if you're like me, I have a hard time retaining names, right? So that his name is on it, so I can address him. I mean, he's a human being. We can, I can say, hey, one of them was named Kevin, as a matter of fact, so that was easy to remember. But I could say, hey, hey Kevin, you're down here working. Can I get you some water or something? You want to have a beer at the end of the day or whatever. But whatever, you can address them cordially, and I personally like that. I think that's a good thing. So now, if you're going to be like crawling under houses or something, I mean, are they going to provide you with the gear you need, with masks or coveralls or whatever? Look, flight attendants, right? They're required to wear a uniform. Presumably the airlines provide those. Presumably they also pay to have them cleaned. I honestly, I don't know. I just assume that that's the case. So again, all of this, is there a uniform? Is there special protective gear that's necessary to do the job? Who supplies it? Who pays for it? Okay, just because the company supplies it, I wouldn't assume that they're paying for it. They may, deduct it from, your pay over the first month or something like that. Who pays for it initially? Who pays for upkeep? Who pays for replacement if something is damaged or broken, whatever, or becomes worn out? Who's going to pay for all of that? Okay, maybe they only pay for it the first time, and then replacements are on you, or whatever it is. Who's going to pay if something gets lost, right? Now, I could imagine the company would say, wait a minute, if you lose something, you're going to have to pay to replace it as an incentive to not lose stuff, right? On the other hand, if something is damaged while you're working, I don't know, it would seem to me reasonable for an employee to say, hey, I'm doing this, doing the work, so, you have to pay to replace it. Now, if you're doing some kind of fee splitting, in terms of work. So who knows? I mean, there's probably as many different ways as that can be agreed to as there are compensation arrangements. So again, the key thing is to understand, A, is it an issue? If so, what are the parameters of the issue? How will they be dealt with? Coming to an agreement, probably, making sure something is done in writing so that there's no misunderstanding down the road. Oh, wow. And that's okay. Let's see. I think. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit over time, but I want to cover these. So transportation, there are companies that will sometimes pay for you to use public transportation. They may give you a car allowance. They may give you a car, especially if you have a job that requires you to travel in the local area. Okay, so if you're, I use the example of a pharmaceutical rep. At least it used to be not uncommon for companies to give their reps a car that then the company pays to maintain, and then the sales rep has like a company credit card to buy gas or whatever. Okay, so again, if that's part of what you're doing, then make sure that that's covered. Okay, and then housing. Okay, this is a fairly unusual in the civilian sector, I think. However, if you're some kind of traveling professional, a traveling nurse, other healthcare professional, if you have to travel and be be out of town for a significant period of time, what is the housing situation? Are you going to stay in one of the extended stay hotels? Do you have the ability to, rent an apartment short term? How is that all going to work? Who's going to pay for it? Do you have to advance the money and get paid back? Is the company going to rent the facility for you? Okay. Now, if you're clergy, sometimes with clergy, there will be a residence that's even attached to the church. And so that comes as part of the job. So how is that going to work? And by the way, what are the tax consequences of these housing arrangements? Okay, they can vary from state to state, right? Federal policy will be whatever it is, but state to state, it could be different. So make sure you understand those before you reach a final agreement. And I think this is the last one. Yes, here you go. Severance package. So what happens if you leave the company? Either if you're laid off, if you're fired, if you choose to take you quit and choose to take another job or retire, what is your severance package? Do you get COBRA on your health insurance, which means you can maintain your health insurance by paying for it yourself for a certain period of time after you leave the company? Do you lose certain benefits if you get fired? Okay, like any retirement benefits you may have, do those have to vest? If you have any kind of deferred compensation, do you lose that if you leave, or is it negotiable so that if you're there for more than a certain period of time, you get a certain portion of your deferred compensation or your incentives? Maybe you have stock incentives or whatever. All of this has to be worked out and understood in terms of what happens if I am no longer going to be with the company. Now, this used to be something only for more senior positions, but now, if you're working for a startup or whatever, where you're not getting a big salary, but you're getting maybe stock options, or you're getting stock in the company or whatever, it's a more important issue to deal with, because the compensation for the long hours that doesn't come through salary is coming perhaps through other means. And so you want to know what happens if you leave the company. Are you going to forfeit those, take them with you? Will the company buy them back? There's as many different ways that these can be handled as there are companies and employers and employees. Okay. All right. So this is the list here. And what I'm going to do is, when I post the show notes, I'm going to post just the list. I'm not going to post all the explanatory stuff, but I'll post the list there for you. And that way, if you can have it to use, if you're heading into negotiations, or you're thinking about switching jobs, or whatever you're doing. And as always, if you have any questions with any of this, feel free to let me know. There'll be ways to contact me in the show notes. You can drop a comment in any of the social media if you're watching it live, and I will be happy to respond to those comments. And okay, so I think that does it. I'm going to stop the screen share here. So a lot of information, and to be able to negotiate well and successfully, you're going to have to do homework. Don't go into the negotiations cold. You're just putting yourself at a disadvantage. Okay. So I want to leave you with that final thought. Make sure that you do your homework before you go into the negotiations. Okay. That way, as they proceed, you may have to do some additional research, but at least you'll have your foundation set from which you can negotiate then to finer points. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I know we went over a little bit on time. Thanks for sticking with me. I appreciate it. Want to remind you, next week on Monday is Trusts and Estates Weekly. My guest is going to be Cheryl Monk, and she is a freelance journalist and who writes frequently on issues related to personal finances, retirement, student loan debt relief, all of these things that affect our ability to become financially stable and build wealth. And I think you will enjoy hearing Cheryl's thoughts. We met because one of her articles was published in the Wall Street Journal. So, that's the level at which, someone who can freelance and have articles picked up by the Wall Street Journal, you can get an idea of the quality of their work. So I think you will enjoy that. That's at 10 a.m. Monday morning Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Tuesday of next week is the next episode of Business Lessons from the Military. That's at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. I hope you'll join me for that. We'll spend a half an hour talking about business doctrine and how it can be applied to growing your businesses and making them more successful. And then a week from today, 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, is the next episode of People Making Money. And I hope you will join me for that. So thank you so much again for joining me. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you next week. And signing off, just want to remember her again. Marie, you are my belle, darling. All the best, folks.